there are some early reports that there's Ukrainian troops heading towards Mariupol on the Black Sea coast, for instance. So these are unconfirmed. But if that is the sort of maneuver that Ukraine is planning over the next couple of days, then that really will be the end of Russian forces. And I think we're going to start to see more collapsing front lines like we've seen in Kharkiv.
It has been an extraordinary 24 hours in the east of Ukraine. Russian forces have been driven back at pace, with President Zelensky claiming that Ukraine has now liberated 700 square miles from Russia since the start of its counteroffensive. Ukrainian officials said troops entered Kupiansk, which is a vital eastern supply hub for Russian forces, on Saturday. Let's speak now to Dr. Mike Martin, who is a visiting research fellow at the Department of War Studies in King's College London and also a British Army officer. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Chloe. Former British Army officer.
I suggested that might have been the case, but I'm afraid I was just reading out what was in front of me, so I do apologise. Former British Army officer. No. Thank you for joining us. I was interested. I was looking at the Twitter thread that you put out yesterday, and you put out a pretty bold statement about the state of the Russian forces right now. Just give us your perspective on what has happened.
So the fundamentals of this war have never really been right for Russia. They've never had enough troops. The troops that they have been poorly trained, poor morale because of the corruption in the forces. They've been sort of poorly equipped. Rather than buying, the military grade stuff, they've bought the cheap stuff and so on and so forth. And the Ukrainians have had the opposite. They've got great Western equipment, more and more coming online all the time. They're fighting to defend their homeland. Their morale is sky high. So I guess that's the background. And then what's happened over the last 2-3 weeks, last month or so, is that the Ukrainians have been pushing in the south in this place called Kherson, which is on the way to Crimea for the Ukrainians. And that caused, because Crimea is very important for the Russians, that's really their strategic center of gravity. The Russians rushed lots of troops into Kherson to defend it. And because they don't have enough troops overall, they thinned out in the northeast in this place called Kharkiv, and also in the Donbass, where they had that offensive a couple of months ago. And what the Ukrainians realized was that there was this huge opportunity. The Russians were spread very, very thinly. And so they took advantage of it. And they just drove a kind of mechanized thrust eastwards from Kharkiv, which is the second biggest city in Ukraine in the northeast. Right through, as you said in your intro, they took Kupiansk. Once they took Kupiansk, because that's a major rail junction, then the Russians had to surrender a place called Izium because they were cut off from supplies. And then it created a kind of domino effect. And what you actually find in war's really about psychology. And once you've shattered your enemy's supply and leadership and its ability to coordinate, the whole thing starts to collapse and dominoes start falling. Everyone panics, troops start running away. And that's really what we're seeing amongst the Russian army. Large pockets of it are, putting on civilian clothes, running away, or getting annihilated, or just pulling out. Like it's a total rout is the only way we can describe it.
And so do you see this as being the start of a real change in the war, or is it limited to certain parts of Ukraine?
Well, my view since the beginning of the war is that this is always a war that Ukraine is going to win eventually, because of those fundamental things that I spoke about, like morale and logistics and so on and so forth. I was thinking that they weren't going to be doing much before winter. Everything's going to slow down over winter, and then probably they'd finish it next summer. As always, I think consistently analysts have underestimated how rubbish Russia is, and just how skilled Ukraine is at using lethal violence to achieve its political goals. So I do think that certainly the whole of the northeast has basically already been liberated. The Russians have been pushed back to the border in that area. We're hearing reports that are currently unconfirmed, but fighting around Donetsk airport, which is right in the Donbass, Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, which your listeners will remember from the Battle of the Donbass. There's Ukrainian troops on the outskirts of that. So I do really think that this is quite a significant chunk of Russian-held territory that they've taken since February. Maybe they might end up with up to a third of it. But I think the real question is that the level of skill that we've seen from the Ukrainians in terms of drawing the Russian troops in the south and then doing a counterstrike in the north and so on and so forth, if the Ukrainians have a further strategic reserve, so a further grouping of soldiers and equipment that they can deploy, then that will be the end for the Russian forces in Ukraine. And there's some speculation as to whether they have that reserve, whether they're going to commit it. But if they do, there are some early reports that there's Ukrainian troops heading towards Mariupol on the Black Sea coast, for instance. So these are unconfirmed. But if that is the sort of maneuver that Ukraine is planning over the next couple of days, then that really will be the end of Russian forces. And I think we're going to start to see more collapsing front lines like we've seen in Kharkiv.
And presumably this is all reliant as well on the West continuing to give weapons and support to Ukraine.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, weapons is something that we hear a lot about. What we hear less of, but is equally important, is intelligence. So since February, that NATO has been flying continuous surveillance flights, obviously satellites, lots of communications intelligence. Ukraine's partners, the US and the UK, are probably the two premier signals intelligence nations in terms of capability. So this enables the Ukrainians to target Russian command and control, troop density, logistics. They're just being fed those locations. And then the final thing is there are British and American officers embedded in elements of the Ukrainian planning and decision-making structure. So we're also, and I don't want to take anything away from the Ukrainians who fought an absolutely amazing battle, bravely fought with exceptional losses. And it really is an example to everyone on how to conduct maneuver warfare, but they also have been getting advice as well as intelligence and weaponry from the West.
Really fascinating. Thank you for speaking to us.
Thank you, Chloe.
That is Dr. Mike Martin, Visiting Research Fellow at the Department of War Studies at King's College London and a former British Army officer.